Welcome to Inside the Set with Set Decor. Inside the Set is a series that focuses on the design and decor of stories that excite us and ignite our imaginations, where we get to discuss the collaborations between production designers and set decorators, and hear firsthand accounts of how those works of art came to be, from their inception to ideas on a page through completion, where we sit in the dark and experience them collectively.
Welcome to Inside the Set with Set Decor. It's my pleasure to welcome our guests. I'm Rosemary, Brandenburg SDSA, and I'm joined by set decorator Claudia Bonfe SDSA and production designer Kasra Farahani to discuss their collaboration on the Emmy-nominated hit Marvel series Loki, now streaming on Disney+. Claudia and Kasra, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you for having us.
First of all, congratulations on the recognition that Loki has already garnered for the design and decor. You won the Art Directors Guild Award in the category of 1 hour period or fantasy single camera TV series. And you were nominated for both the Emmy Award and the Set Decorators Society Television 2021 Award. So that's pretty fabulous. Congrats.
Thank you very much.
Kasra, starting with you, please. How did you find the project and what made it something you wanted to do?
Actually, a friend of mine had heard about the project and had been told that it was something sort of distinctive within the Marvel world, that it was going to be different. She had it on good authority that it was going to be different, and that the narrative parameters and the visual parameters based on the early stuff that was available to read at that stage seemed different. And so she's a production designer herself. That's actually my friend, Maya Shimaguchi. And she wasn't available to interview for it. And she told me I should try to find out about it. And so it was one of those very uncommon occasions where you ask your agent about something and they're actually able to get you the interview on it. So I did that, and it just worked out well. It seemed that Kate Herron, the director, and myself had a lot of the same references come to mind upon reading the outlines that were available to read at that stage.
And Claudia, how did you come to the project? I don't know if you and Kasra have worked together before prior to Loki.
No, and I didn't even know him, but a mutual friend of ours, Jennifer Lukart, she had passed on the show. So she gave my number to Kasra and he called me, and we interviewed. And I think, with my relationship with Marvel and me being so excited about doing this project, I think it just worked out.
What was the excitement that you found when you began to hear about Loki? What was the difference from other Marvel projects, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it was the Marvel world in mid-century, but not really. It's we don't know the time period, and it jumps around to different times. And I just knew that it would be not just one style throughout the whole show, that we'd be able to do other types of design throughout each episode. Every episode was different, and then we keep going back to the TVA, which has that mid-century feel, and then Kasra's ideas and research and illustrations were amazing. So it was a no-brainer that I wanted to do that show.
Oh, that's great. And so, Kasra, you mentioned your conversations with director Kate Herron in the initial days were remarkably synchronous. Were there particularly useful references from history and architecture that informed your kind of collaboration?
Yes, I think that part of the brief, and this was very helpful because it was it enabled me to prepare a pretty focused presentation going into it. But part of the brief that we'd gotten from the written materials from the show's creator, Michael Waldron, stipulated this idea of like Blade Runner meets Mad Men, which is immediately sort of an evocative idea and very helpful starting point. And so the kind of architecture that comes to mind when you think about that, and I'll throw into the mix Gilliam's world, which is sort of a natural reference that in some ways combines not exactly mid-century modernism that you have in Mad Men, but a very designed world with the dystopic sort of deconstructed elements of Blade Runner. I feel like Gilliam's world, specifically Brazil, has some of that, where it's like very designed. In that case, it's a lot of 40s and 30s and 50s tech colliding with a dystopic version of it. So with those references in mind, there was a very specific type of architecture and decor language that presented itself.
Wow, that is quite the treatise. I love that. That's really interesting. Claudia, you mentioned before that you had worked with marble quite a bit, and some of that was as assistant set decorator on several films with the late great set decorator Leslie Pope. How did your familiarity with the marble world assist you as you approached Loki?
Well, Leslie was my mentor, and she, she was very familiar with the Marvel universe and how their productions are structured. So I just, basically took guidance from her. I became a decorator because Leslie had passed away, so it wasn't a really exciting time for me to do the transition. But I, she was just a really important person in my life, and I just took notes from her, not knowing that I would become a set decorator. It wasn't really in my future. There's just a system that they have, and there's certain people that work for them, like Russell Bobbitt and Dan Sudik, and that continue to work on the Marvel project. So it was easy for me to transition into being a set decorator and working with them because I was familiar with the people who are in that world. And then I've worked on Avengers, which deals with every single character in the world, in the Marvel world universe, pretty much. So it's funny though, because Loki was my least favorite character because to me, he was so unlikable. So I was curious to see how that would go. And then, I just ended up falling in love with the character.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, the secrecy at Marvel is sort of legend. Yes. And that can be a little bit daunting, especially if you haven't done the project. So having the fact that you had done them was probably very helpful. Kasra, you and I met so many years ago, and I knew you as a concept designer and illustrator, and which you did for so many years, including on a number of Marvel projects. How did your background in concept work sort of inform your work as production designer for the project?
I think the biggest impact working as a concept artist or an illustrator has on what I think what you prioritize as a production designer is that you prioritize image making as opposed to just spatial design, which is, I think, helpful, because I think it's very easy when you're designing a 3D space to lose sight of the fact that ultimately the end product, the deliverable, if you will, is a two-dimensional image, is not a three-dimensional space. The three-dimensional space is in service of a photographed 2D image in the end. So working as an illustrator for a long time was very helpful to be able to keep that in mind and make design decisions in service of that. I think the one area or two areas that it impacts most dramatically are color choice, or color usage rather, and lighting design, because I do think it's not my original idea. I've heard it from a lot more talented and experienced people than myself, that maybe the biggest part of production design is sort of lighting design.
That was intense, your lighting on that. But we'll get to that one in a minute. Claudia, can you describe how early in the process you came on board? And as you started your process, did you have favorite references or influences that you perhaps brought in yourself?
I started, I think, a little bit under 4 months before we started shooting, and we had holidays in between there. So I came on fairly early on. And my inspiration, I mean, the other day I was looking through my photos looking for something for this job that I'm on now, and I came upon the time when I started on Loki, and I remember my first day walking into Kasra's office, and his walls were covered with research, and it was all mid-century architecture or furniture, which was really great because sometimes it's all about in the beginning, the designers maybe might just start with just the architecture and not really have any suggestions of furniture. So Kasra he knew exactly what he wanted. His illustrations matched the sets. I mean, you could probably lay them on top of each other and not know the difference if it's an illustration or the actual set. So he was very clear about what he wanted from the beginning. My inspiration for the mid-century is that it's just my favorite time period. So I'm very familiar with it. You know, I grew up in Minnesota. I didn't have a lot of mid-century mid-century furniture. It was not very popular there until I moved to California. But when I was going to design school, you know, we study all different periods of architecture and furniture design, and mid-century was the one that stood out the most to me, and I feel like I could relate to it the most. And I just like the colors. And so the inspiration for me came from, you know, my love of mid-century, and then Kasra's influence of his research.
Claudia, you are understating. You have, I think mid-century modernism is easy to like, and I think it's very popular among art directors and set decorators. But I think you have a kind of expert encyclopedic knowledge, a breadth of knowledge about mid-century modernism and the specifics of the furniture and the decor and the wall sculpture and all of that is at a pretty elite level. And I think you and I both got lucky in that we both love this period, and we got the opportunity to work on this project that was really utilizing that natural area of interest that we both had. So while there were some things that I'll disagree with you in one thing, is like, while there were some sets that I had a lot of clarity on what the set deck was, there's plenty of sets that I feel like I had only a very general idea of the decor, and you filled in a lot of those blanks.
Well, that's great. A mutual admiration society. I love it. In the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, Kasra, which, you know, at its core is a kind of a bloated bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Did you find some guiding principles to portray this idea at the TVA?
Yeah, I think so. And I touched on it a little bit earlier, that it's like, I thought the core idea was this contrast between an oppressive, autocratic, monolithic bureaucracy that deprives you of choice, and through all the graphic design and posters and propagandas, constantly has a condescending attitude towards the people that it governs. And yet the finishes and the colors suggest a happier and more fun setting than that. So you're kind of you're constantly pushing and pulling between repetition, everything trying to erode anyone feeling unique, and then propagandizing it to feel like it's inviting. So it's trying to hold those two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time in the design of the space.
one thing you touched on a minute ago that I wanted to get into is regarding the color palette. It seemed like, I'm just imagining working on a project like this, it seemed like there was likely a fairly complex process to come up with the exact right shade of gray for the concrete, the exact right shade of red that was often used. I mean, there was a through line of red there, as well as like the wood colors for the executive hallway or the judge's room. And I know you worked with a friend of mine, Larry Clark, who's the head scenic.
Oh, good.
So can you describe a little bit how that goes, so people who don't know how that works?
Sure. So this color, this orange, which we ended up calling TVA orange, it took a lot of effort and iteration early on to find this color. But once we found it, it was well utilized. It was used all the time, and it became sort of the signature color of the institution. And it sort of tells the story exactly. Like this room is a great example of what I was talking about, where there are no windows. There's no way to distinguish one door from the other. It's essentially a prison in some ways. And what happens when you go through that big door, as we see in the show, is pretty awful. And yet it's presented in these really bright, inviting colors. But yeah, arriving at the colors themselves, the orange was the key, I think. And once we had the orange, that was the kind of thing that we used as a frame of reference to find the rest of the palette. And there were yellows and browns, which are, again, these like warm, inviting colors to contrast the windowlessness, the oppressive windowlessness of it all.
Like a set like this, for example, I'm curious to know, I'm always, when I look at projects, I'm very curious to know which sets you build and which sets are on location, for example, and working with your locations team. For example, this sort of almost like a DMV room, which is sort of the entry to where you have to take the ticket and so on. Is that one, for example, a location? What were some examples of? I mean, it looks like you built everything, and it was so perfect.
We did build everything.
You built this whole room with all.
We built pretty much everything, Rosemary. I think the only one that was, maybe not the only one, but there's an archives, a TVA archives, that was a beautiful John Portman hotel in Atlanta that we used for the archives. It was heavily set extended. And truthfully, there were never meant to be a lot of locations, but our show happened, like so many, when the COVID outbreak occurred. And so we shut down for a time. And when we came back, the few things that were meant to be location we were encouraged to do on stage as well. So that came down even more.
Well, it was seamless. All of the locations, just even the few locations that you had, just blended. The place looked really unified. However, there was an upstairs, downstairs quality to it, which I really enjoyed.
Oh, good.
Claudia, not just the polished upper offices, but you also did like the functional employees downstairs checking people in, the Miss Minutes queue area, that guy with the pass through doing the security. That was fabulous. How did you approach, Claudia, the decor for these different levels and for the invented world here?
Well, we basically made like the lousy machine, which is the robot. We made that with the help of Mr. Dan Sudik. So that was all made designed and through the art department, our specialty set designers, and all the wires were put in through Set Deck. Everything was built in those sets, except I think in the paperwork chamber, which was the first one you showed, where the gentleman is sitting at the desk. So we just brought in the paperwork and the filing cabinets, but we made the little stand, his little check-in stand, and with a beautiful real marble top that you can't see. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, it was so beautiful.
Yeah. Everything was custom, but there's one thing about this set that I love, and it's repeated in a lot of the sets, is that there's little bits of humor in it, and that's what I like about part of the reason why I like working with Kasra is because he's the one that threw in, the cat mug and the cat and the sandwich on a plate. And I just think these little simple details that you might not see unless you pause the show, but they're things that make us laugh when we're dressing the set. So, this is one of our smaller sets, but it was a fun one.
It was very effective.
That cat mug was
the most expensive mug
epic.
ever. That was hand painted. The stripes on there were hand painted by Larry Clark, who you had mentioned earlier, Rosemary. And we had several mug options. Oh, and the interesting thing about this is that there was one cat that they chose, and then they couldn't, for some reason they didn't cast that cat, but it looked totally different. And then they casted another cat, but they said that the cat sometimes leaves the set. So we have a backup cat. So we had to make, with our second and third cat, we had to make 2 more mugs. So there were many versions of cat mugs and different cats that were supposed to be in the scene.
Oh my, the complication that is behind the scenes, you just don't really realize when you're looking at these things. It's something else. There were so many wonderful accents, Claudia, in the TVA. The mid-century furniture were such classics. You had the Time Theater, you had the Sarin and Tulip table, and the wire Victoria chairs. And these wonderful pieces of sitting furniture. Something tells me that was a custom rug, or was that an applique on the floor on the set?
Yeah, we made all of the rugs, and they were made by they weren't just printed on top of the carpet. It was a process, and we had them made by real carpet manufacturer. So it took a while. We had to have the files done about 6 weeks in advance, and then we had to do many versions of test prints, but they looked gorgeous in person, and they'll last forever. But in this particular set, the sofa that you see on the right there, the Milo Bauman sofa, is a sofa that I bought when I was doing all the Avengers and all the Marvel projects in Atlanta. They have a warehouse, as you know, and so we can pull from past projects if it's something that they're not going to end up in another show again. And this particular sofa I bought on Avengers, and for some reason it didn't work in the set. The scale wasn't right, but they held on to it. And then they had an auction after it aired, and because it wasn't used, it was sold. And I ended up going to the Marvel warehouse to look. When I started on this project, I went to go look at the furniture, and I got lost, and I ended up in this building a block away, and I walked into their lobby, and that sofa, which is what I was thinking about when I started the show, that I'd love to use the sofa, that sofa was sitting in their lobby. And I said, where did you get that? Because it was upholstered in a way that I know it was original. And they told me that they had bought it from an auction from some movie. And I bought it again from them and used it in this project. And we ended up upholstering. We kept the vinyl, the original vinyl, the cushions on the top cushions, and then we upholstered the frame of it. So,
oh wow, that's
so I did repurpose some stuff from Avengers. Those chairs on the opposite side were in the Avengers compound, and I mean, they're just a classic. They're not Knoll original, but they look like a Knoll chair that the scale was perfect with this sofa.
Well, these are beautiful pieces. You have benches, and your lighting is outstanding in the whole piece. Where you were doing wall sconces. You had some striking square wall sconces in the executive hallways. You had, obviously, this is the judge's office with her incredible lamp. You had so many amazing lamps. You had, can you describe some of the search for all of the lighting that you had in the film?
Basically, most of the lighting, we did some sort of modification with it. That light that's on her desk, that was a fixture that we had purchased before the shutdown, and I knew it was going to be perfect for I knew the shape that was going to work perfectly on her desk, but it didn't arrive because there was no one to receive it because we shut down. So when we came back, we thought that it had showed up because it showed that it had shipped, and then it was missing in action. So there's a whole story behind that, but my wonderful assistant decorators, Mallory Coleman and Jen Sendell, figured it out and ended up showing up just right before we shot this.
Very close calls.
Yeah.
Kasra, here's an example. I would imagine on the left of the judge's office where you had the insignia, and you mentioned your work with the graphics designer Jason Swears. There were so many graphics in the film. Can you get a little deeper into what that process of design on the graphics and the posters was like?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the truth of the matter is Jason Swears is one of the, if not the most talented graphic designer I've ever worked with. And he, again, the producer Kevin Wright and I often talk about how this project was sort of lightning in a bottle, because like Claudia and I having this kind of passion for this period of art and design, Jason similarly did as well. And so his recall of specific typefaces and implementation of typography versus imagery, when to use a gradient, when to use a pattern, what sort of forms evoke what period, is sort of beyond reproach. I mean, he has such command of these. And believe me when I tell you, the other thing that was sort of head spinning is how fast he could generate these things. We were very lucky to get Jason, and that he just sort of was in sync with where we all were on this. In terms of this insignia itself, it was, again, one of those things where you're trying to find the right cocktail of official, period, and slightly intimidating, with the sword and the shield and the two kind of pupilless eyes in the center. There's a few kind of different important pieces of thematics that were going on in terms of arriving at the design of that insignia. What we're looking at here was a joint effort from so many people. These mosaics, which we made, and these were 16 feet tall. They're massive things, and they were designed in concert with Joe Stadzinski, one of our illustrators, and Jason, who I was just speaking about, our graphic designer. The process of taking these things from illustration into a vector program like Illustrator and converting them basically into a matrix of tiny tiles, and then figuring out a way to print them. You can't see in these wide shots, but these were all printed using a dimensional printing technique. What that means is that the tiles were all raised while the grout was recessed, as it would be with a real mosaic. So these things had a really beautiful texture and sheen to them, like a real mosaic would. And that's to the credit of Jason and Joe sort of working together on that to get solve this particular graphic design problem.
They were pretty incredible.
Yeah, and Claudia, here's an example with these benches. Something tells me those weren't just off the shelf.
No, we made the benches.
Of course you did.
Yeah, I mean, we manufactured quite a bit. If it wasn't manufactured, it was modified in some way. So some of the sets might be very minimal with furniture, but it was there was a lot of time and taken to figure out what fits perfectly within those sets.
What kind of resources did you have for building furniture and dressing pieces that you needed to accomplish in the time frame?
Most of the wood pieces were done by Mike Miller and his construction crew. And then all of my 3D printing, like the pedestal there. That was done by Dan Sudik and his amazing team.
And just to interrupt, our Dan Sudik, we've mentioned him several times. He's the very famous special effects coordinator who is often working on the Marvel films and television series.
Yeah, so when I started in Los Angeles, and then we moved out to Atlanta and really got going, I had a whole list of, in fact, a spreadsheet of builds that I knew we had to do in each set, because a lot of the TVA sets were already well underway and designed. So even though the files weren't ready for Dan, I at least had some sort of image from an illustration just to start a conversation. And yeah, we basically manufactured everything. Those lockers were a little bit taller than they should have been, so we had to cut them down, and then we painted them, and they fit perfectly in the set there.
I love these orange benches. When I saw that, I was like, oh, those are so cool.
Yeah, they're really cool. That was, I mean, the design was straight off of one of Kasra's illustrations, but Rob Johnson, I think that was Rob who a specialty set designer, he helped us put those together. We had to modify the legs because the engineering, it didn't work the way that
often the case with illustrations. Yes.
Kasra, that was very noble of you to admit.
But I don't even know if we discussed that. It was just such a slight change, but they look great. I love them.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah. Kasra, where did you get the idea for these cool benches? I really like them.
You know what? I mean, we were slotted pretty firmly in the mid 60s for most things, but there were some things that veered as early as 1958 and some things that veered as late as 1972, 1974. I think these benches have like a early 70s Italian design influence behind them. And the graphics in this set, this was an Armory set, which was a changeover of the Miss Minutes queue. You may recognize the ceiling is the same ceiling. So this one, it just had a slightly more 70s feel about it, this one. And it was a locker room, so many people needed to sit at the same time to suit up. It's a locker room and an armory. This was one of many sets that were not strictly in the script, but were proposed kind of sets that consolidated things that were different sets in the script. So like maybe there was an armory set, and then there was a locker room set, and then there was a set where they would deploy to missions. And there was not enough page count in any one set to be able to justify spending much money there. So this set, for instance, which we ended up calling the Armory, was a combination of literally those three things, where they would suit up and then get their weapons on their way out. And you can see there's a time door at the end of the set where they would deploy to missions. So by consolidating those three things, we got to an acceptable page count, and we could actually have enough money to do something with the set.
Cool. Claudia, on this particular set, the Armory, it's one of the many wonderful ceilings in the TVA. Were those actually light fixtures, or was it a ceiling with holes that you put specialty bulbs in?
Well, they're actually built into the ceiling. So construction built those fixtures, and then the bulbs were just put in by our fixtures department. So it was all built into the ceiling.
But the top half of the bulbs, the bottom half of they're silver tip bulbs, so the bottom half are chrome. The top half was clear, but the clear bit was giving off strange shapes as reflected into the white bowls. So basically we ended up having Larry Clark ended up frosting the top half of literally every one of these bulbs with paint.
That looks like a lot of bulbs.
And
And again, only one of many, many wonderful ceilings.
this set was really incredible to go into because the ceiling was so low, it made you feel really uncomfortable. And that's what I loved about it, because that's, you're not supposed to, it's like, this is the first pitch that Kasra said to me when he called. He said it's kind of like a stuck in the 60s DMV. And I didn't imagine this set, but I imagine it looking like this with the wood paneling. And but this was one of my favorite sets to go into. And the light bulbs were never on, so we had to have work lights in there, so it was really dark. And kind of a little creepy when you were in there by yourself. But it looked cool standing in that room.
Yeah, the ceiling's only 7'6" in there. So, so it slammed really low, and so it feels like you're in a trash compactor or something.
It's tempting to spend the entire interview on the TVA, but you created a series of other planets and worlds that provided amazing contrast to this. Like, for example, the planet Lamentis 1 had a number of great sets. I noted that you had some frontier structures with houses and roofs, Kasra, that looked a bit like maybe mining helmets might have been your inspiration there. I wasn't sure, but they looked really unusual and interesting. It's a great addition to the many frontier towns that have been done in science fantasy. What am I right? Was that inspired by a mining helmet?
Definitely mining helmets, mining equipment generally was that. And just the idea of two types of architecture that would have been improvised based on found materials, and another type of architecture which would have been something that would have been 3D printed in place from concrete. So all of those were kind of influences for things on Lamentis 1. And as you rightly identify, Rosemary, the heat was on with that episode just because as written, it was set in a type of setting that we have seen before, especially in the Marvel world. Even there's been a few different versions of something like that.
And then you went to the bigger town, of course, which I guess was called Truro or something.
Truro, right? Yeah. Truro, yeah.
Which you shot at night with a remarkable use of color and light. And I was wondering if you could give us some detail about how you worked with the DP Autumn Tva Archives to build the complex sequence, which was, I guess, shot in one big camera shot. What was the planning of that like for you?
Sure. Yes. Another way in which we were all lucky and there was lightning in the bottle is Autumn is staggeringly talented person and very collaborative, and has gone on to she's just finishing the second Black Panther film now. But it was a great collaboration, and the sequence was presented as a oneer. It was in actuality, a dozen or so shots that were stitched together seamlessly. But this was a set in which we had to work very closely with lighting. We had, the goal here was to try to find a vernacular, a visual language that was sort of different. So the way we hope we achieved it was to use a lot of UV light reactive blacklight paint, basically. So every building has an elaborate, like, sort of op art-esque pattern on it, made up of some paints that are blacklight reactive and some paints that are not blacklight reactive. And we embedded into the set, I think, hundreds of UV lights, basically. So you can see on the building on the right, the orange is just popping, almost floating in front of the other color, like a hologram. And that's because it's blacklight reactive and the other color wasn't. You see it again there with the pale blue, and here again with the orange in foreground. So that was something we could do to sort of almost simulate visual effects in camera. And that took a lot of collaboration between art department, set decoration, and lighting and camera to make that all work.
It's really quite remarkable and beautiful because it doesn't look like all the other sort of the classic sci-fi cities. It looked really different and cool. And Claudia, you had to provide quite a bit here. This is a large area And many practicals, awnings, bar interior dressing, vendor stands, endless street dressing, electric cables. And what was sort of the backstory for the town? I mean, did you have a through line here for the set dressing?
It started with to get the storefronts, like what storefronts we were going to do with graphics. They basically came up with the idea that we were going to do a market. I think there was a church or like a prayer center. Because of the graphic designer driving that, then we were able to pick out, how we wanted to dress each of these storefronts. It's interesting because there's a lot of vendor carts. There's a lot of set dressing pieces in this, but it's hard to see them because it's so dark in the set, and we dress, you dress a set during the daytime, and then the whole thing is seen at night. You get it's such a different perspective watching it over again. And we also chose set dressing pieces based on the color palette, like those bar stools that we're looking at right now. That's a hot pink stool top, which just ended up working nicely with the color palette that Kasra chose for the paints. We stayed away from wood. We really wanted to do hard surfaces, plastics, metals, and concrete. So that's sort of how we start our shopping process. The market was my favorite. I don't think you saw it at all, but it was probably the most dressed.
Yeah, it's weird. That was the one that you saw the least. I think it's because it's right where they walk in, so they just walk past it. It was frustrating because it was beautiful.
Well.
Yeah, but my set dressers did such a fantastic job with all you don't see all the pipes that they did. There were many pipes, conduit, wires. We built those light fixtures. Again, Mr. Sudik did that for us, built those for us. It was a lot, but it shot at the end of the schedule pretty much. So that really helped us. Even though there were a lot of sets leading up to that, I think it was scheduled to shoot earlier than that, and then maybe because of COVID, I don't remember, but it ended up almost the last set, and that helped us because we were really heavy up front. Set deck had a lot of work to do up front, so I don't think we would have been able to populate the set this much, just with if it would have shot at a different time.
It was kind of a sizzling environment. It was really cool. Moving along to yet another planet, you went, I guess it was episode 5, you went to the planet, which I guess they refer to as the Void. And, after trekking through a bunch of sad gray heaths, and it's kind of a disaster of a planet. And then you go down the hatch to the Loki Palace, the ruined bowling alley, which was quite a visual feast. Kasra, can you tell us a little bit about the concept for the Void planet and how all these things came together, these odd bits and pieces come together in this planet?
Yes, this was one of those things. I think it'll probably never happen again in my career. I just feel like we got so lucky being allowed to make this set because, it wasn't really in the script. It was described, there was like 2 lines of description about what it was. Like they went down at a tunnel and it arrived in a temple, in a Loki temple, and there was not much description other than that. And so, basically arrived at this idea. Number one, if I'm honest, because I thought it would be beautiful to do a really weird alien version of the bowling alley from The Big Lebowski, but narratively, I think the pitch was that the Void is basically a landfill or a dumping ground for things that were deleted from time because they crossed some line, they did something they weren't supposed to do, and so it just falls out of the sky and lands here or just appears here. And so it stands to reason that over time there would be an accumulation and there would be strata. So the idea was that if you went down, you might land in something that was deleted some time ago. And because the surface of the Void is patrolled by this thing called the Lyeth, which is basically a big purple cloud monster that devours everything, these Loki variants that the characters come in contact with in this episode had burrowed beneath the ground and basically found this safe house. And the idea was that it was some sort of a strange mid-century bowling alley that had been invaded by these big green alien vines, and that there in the middle, they'd carved out a sort of a throne room for themselves, and the conceit was that the throne itself was raided out from another deleted reality not far, and the pitch was that it was a mall Santa's throne from a shopping mall, and so it had a weird Christmas theme to the throne mixed with the bowling theme of the space, colliding with alien plants, and there's a lot of things going on, and this is an example of one of the places where the set dressing, other than the bowling stuff and the Christmas stuff, I didn't have a lot of ideas about it. So Claudia and her team brought in an extraordinary mix of eclectic, beautiful, very charactery, colorful set dressing in here.
Claudia, take it away. What all these games, carnival leftovers, eclectic furniture. How did you go about it?
Well, it's interesting because a bowling alley had never been mentioned on the show. So we were at one of the biz dev meetings, and I was sitting next to Kasra, and he was doing some designing on his computer, his computer was right there in front of my face, and I saw that he was like, what is he doing with this mid-century bowling alley? And like, he was kind of, I got to see how his creative process worked, and he was putting it together. And I thought, I don't know, maybe that's a different project. I don't remember anything about a bowling alley. And then the next meeting, there's this beautiful illustration of this crazy set that I was like, this is really fun. I mean, this is like my dream sets to ever do. So it was easy for me. It was very fun. For me, textures and colors is what gets me motivated to start the design process for shopping. For instance, the Eames chair that he's sitting on, I did not want an original Eames chair. I wanted something that looked like a reproduction. I didn't want it to look like it belonged in the TVA. And that love seat that Loki is sitting on, I was shopping with Mallory Coleman, who was my lead buyer on the set, and we were at Caps, the Prop House Caps in Atlanta, and I saw that shine. It looked like a circus, something that had come from the circus, and I thought, this is really nice. It's got a nice poppy color. It's got these stripes in it, and I didn't even want to show Kasra because I thought that he was maybe not going to like it, and I really wanted him to see it in the set. And it's because it was easy for us. It was fun. Everything is vintage, and even like the beer cans that you see in the shot there, we found a bunch of old beer cans. It's like their man cave. It was fun.
Well, last but not least, your other set, which was pretty remarkable, was in episode 6. We go to I guess they call it the Citadel, the fortress on the top of the asteroid, and the fellow that they refer to as he who remains. He dwells all alone in this crazy place. So it looks a bit like a Gothic volcanic stone or something, with a very strong veining running through. And can you describe a little bit about, Kasra, your design choices for this setting?
This set sort of or this environment exists to a degree in the comics, in that there is a kind of a temple or something on top of an asteroid. So that was the kind of the kernel from which we started. And then what occurred to me was that it would be nice if the Citadel itself was not erected in a typical architectural fashion, but rather it was carved in situ, sort of like Petra or something in Jordan, where it's like there's lots of very specific architectural, even neoclassical, and in this case, English Gothic architectural details. But the idea was that they were hewn right there in situ from the asteroid itself, as opposed to built elsewhere and then brought here and assembled. That's why you have this veining that's everywhere, and that's why the veining continues from one surface into another surface without interruption. And there's a lot of cryptic time-related graphics and astrolabes and all this stuff built into the floor. These photos, I took these photos myself. I regret not putting somebody in them because you can't really get a sense of the scale of the place, but they were pretty vast vast spaces. And part of that is because these sets were designed and sort of construction or documentation began at a time where the scenes in these sets were quite different and much longer. As it happened, when it came time to shoot, all the work was in this set, which was the final of the 3 Citadel sets. And the other 2 sets were very elaborate hallways, basically, that the characters walked through in order to reach this one. But this one, which is the office, was extraordinary because it's the only place here where there were things in the Citadel that were not carved from the Citadel itself. So Claudia found an unbelievable collection of like time related and sort of mysticism related obscura and like beautiful, super unique, strange items from all over the world and different cultures, and really brought a mysterious and elegant quality to the scene.
What were your biggest pleasure and your challenge on the project?
I think that the pleasure is easy, which was that I think there's a few things. Well, number one, that it was this was a piece of material within the Marvel world, and yet it was sort of unobligated to existing Marvel storylines. It was its own thing, so we had a lot of freedom. Other than the next thing would be the fact that so much of it is set in mid-century modernism, which is so easy to like, whether you're educated about design or you're not educated about design. For audiences, for artists that are working on it, I think it represents a high point in aesthetics, and it's just easy to get behind. And then third, I think we were just so lucky to have a series of scripts that had so much visual variety in them, that allowed us to do a big chunk of the work as in this lovely world of mid-century modernism, and yet a lot of other variety and fun opportunities to do silly things as well. In terms of challenges, I think there's just, this is the nature of streaming, where you're sort of doing 5-6 Marvel movies, and you actually have less money, not more, than you do. And then also, I think just specifically in terms of set construction, what we were trying to do in building sets that had ceilings was a hard sell. But there was a period at the beginning that was incredibly stressful, if I'm honest, in the kind of selling this idea and getting the budgets worked out to get the permission to do that. That was really hard. It was a rough few weeks, but it paid off, and everyone was happy in the end.
Yeah, the ceilings were remarkable, and I'm sure they were glad they ended up funding that. Claudia, same question. Your pleasures and your challenges.
I think my pleasures were I was really surprised at how much support I got from the producers, and this being my first Marvel project decorating. Trish Standard, she was extremely supportive of me, and my team, they were just on board, and knowing that I hadn't really, this was probably my first project from start to finish, from doing the budgeting to finishing the show by myself. The other big project that I had done was when Leslie had left the show at the beginning. So it was the first time I, really had to figure this out, and everybody was so supportive to special effects, to Russell Bobbitt and props, to Mike Miller and construction. And you really need that support of the other department heads, and then having a really strong art department that it all helps. So I that was the biggest surprise, and I was so delighted in the end. And I always look back at that saying it could have gone another way, and appreciate that. But the struggles that I had was it's going from doing a movie to a streaming show. It's a totally different experience, because it is, like Kasra said, you're doing almost 6 hours of, a movie's like 2 hours, and you're shooting it in the same amount of time, because I think it was like a 4-month shoot. And the money is we don't have the same amount of money, but they want it to look like movie quality.
It's interesting to hear you say that this was one of your first as a decorator from start to finish, because I think of you as so accomplished and experienced, and your obviously your training was excellent, and you're obviously were totally prepared and all over this project. You both were. I just wanted to say thank you for this incredible conversation, Kasra and Claudia. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us today for Inside the Set with Set Decor.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Inside the Set with Set Decor. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website, setdecor.com.